I promised Nizam that I wouldn't speak about airplanes, which is my favorite topic, and flying, but I will talk about performance science, and more importantly, what is the missing link in our current understanding of performance science. This is a hybrid specialty. It's derived mostly from business management. It's derived from professional athletics and the sports industry, and also from health and safety in the aviation industry. I think we have all worked in institutions that have excellent infrastructures, they're well-resourced, and yet the outcomes are never extraordinary. Similarly, we have worked with individuals who are very bright and very well trained, but yet outcomes are never beyond, well, shall I say, mediocre. Okay? So the question is, if you do high-performance surgery, transplantation in children, how do you create high-level performance? We performed a very extensive review of the grey literature and asked this very question. And essentially, the traditional recipe is that quality comes from operators, and by this I mean not just surgeons, but anyone functioning within a process. That is to say, not just their technical skills, but also the way they make decisions, the way they behave, the way they solve problems, what's known as non-technical skills, and also systems. And I'm sorry, I was looking for an Evelina picture as well, but it could be Evelina as well as Gosh. Systems are about the resources you have, yes, equipment, yes, robots, but also about the policies, the infrastructures, and more importantly, the other people that are within your network, the people you can call for when you have a problem. Yet this is not enough, and we feel that the missing link here is culture. Now, culture is a very dangerous thing because it is a vague bucket where people throw things when they don't know what to do with them. If you want to be nasty to someone, you just say they have a toxic culture. If anything is not right, it must be cultural. Okay? So what is culture? The problem with culture is that it's an interface between humans and their environments, and it is essentially a lens through which you see your world and the world sees you. It is a prism that shapes, and it is a filter that colors your outlook on everything that you do. This is a classic social psychology experiment. We designed it based on Hannah's dog, German Shepherd. If you show a room, a relatively scary-looking dog, half the room will say that is a best friend, the other will say that it's a predator. And irrespective of the fact that we all have the same background, the same education, we have the same interests, we share the same geography in this room, we will be very split on this. And this highlights very clearly that actually people with very obvious similarities can have very dissimilar views on the same singular problems. And this may be shaped by the way you saw your parents react to animals when you're small. It could be that you're bitten by a dog on the way to school, or it could be that your best friend at school was a dog. But you can never quite predict what people's cultures are like. It's an entity that's invisible, and it's an entity that is very occult. And if you ignore it, you do so at your own peril. What we do know is that culture, or culture of achievement, is commonly seen in all highly performing teams. Whether it's the London Symphony Orchestra down the road, or whether it's the special boat service up in Poole, or whether it's Red Arrows, if you get your culture right, you will win. Coyle describes culture as the element which makes groups add up to more than just the sum of their parts. And we would argue that this is actually the winning element. Now, culture has three major problems. One, it is difficult to define. Two, it's difficult to measure. And as a result, it's very difficult to improve. So we set out, in true Guy's style, to resolve all three of these. And the first was to define culture. John Kotter, who's the guru of leadership at Harvard Business School, would describe culture as the way we do things around here. It is about our habitual behaviors. Culture is a software of the mind or a behavioral code that ultimately impacts on how we do what we do. But that's just a definition. What are the components? If you are to anatomically dissect me, and try to extract my culture, what are the different components or silos into which culture falls? The first is about identities. Who am I? Secondly, is about my goals. What am I about? Thirdly, it's about attitudes. What do I deem to be true? Fourthly, it's about values. That is to say, how do I attribute worth? What is good and what is bad? And finally, it's about norms. What is the status quo that I expect? This impacts on the way I react to events and how I interact with other humans, and ultimately on the way I behave. Fine. How do I measure it? In social science, phenomena like culture are measured with questionnaires. This is good for two reasons. One, if someone's giving me a questionnaire, I can lie. And two, if I'm giving it to someone else, I can manipulate them with the questions that I have. So I don't think questionnaires are the way forward. The problem with culture is that we don't know what questions to put in a questionnaire because we haven't had any studies about it in surgery. So we went back to basics. As part of surgical training, your mentors or your tutors always give you sage pieces of advice. If you operate with Nizam and you call him at 2 o'clock in the morning and you say, look, the kidney's not passing any urine, he'll always tell you never sit on a perfusion problem. That's part of his culture. He understands that ischemia is time sensitive and he'll always tell you to take the kidney back to theatre. If you operate with Nikos and you're a bit rough, he'll tell you respect the tissues and they'll respect you back. If you operate with Francis, I won't even tell you what he says. But something like, if you put a dodgy kidney in a sick child, you'll get a dodgy outcome. Denton Cooley used to say that inattention to detail is the hallmark of mediocrity. Okay? So what is this all about? I mean, is this valuable? Is this just some old surgeons sharing their lifelong experience? Mostly old, yeah. Well, it's not, because we found out that these had three characteristics. First of all, they were consistently phrased in the same way. They tell you the same thing every time. The second thing is they keep telling it to you all the time. They keep repeating it on and on and on. And then these phrases, these cultural utterances, as they are scientifically expressed, are triggered by the same stimuli. So what we said was actually these are portholes into people's cultures. This is about their identity, their values, their attitudes. And actually it's a fantastic opportunity to understand what their culture is without any questionnaires and without any traditional means of assessing culture. So we said that cultural utterances are target, and these are maxims or focus pieces of advice or rules of the road, as it were, for high performance, or what scientifically is known as conceptually synoptic phrases, which is boring. So we set out to do a study on mapping out surgical culture, in particular looking at surgical culture in highly performant teams. The aim was to try to distill what good culture looks like. Methodologically, we used ethnographic methods, that is to say, the same methods you use to study tribes. And I know the nephrologists will laugh that having called us Neanderthals for so long, now we've gone back to using folkloric methods of studying surgical behaviors. But yes, we did use ethnographic methods of study. We used thematic analysis using the framework method, and we used semi-structured observational fieldwork, which basically means you take an individual, an observer, you implant them in a community of practice, and they sit there and they listen for these recurrent cultural utterances. You collect them, analyze them, and then distill that unit's culture. So this is a study that we've been doing for 13 years. I started it as a medical student in 2005. I've performed 31 field trips in the UK, US, and Europe. We collected over 500 axioms from over 134 surgeons. This is, to our knowledge, the largest ethnographic study of surgical behavior ever. And the data was then filtered and put into different silos based on thematic maps. And this is what a thematic map looks like, particularly looking at surgical mindset. And you can choose what level of detail you want to expand or contract. So what did we find? We found that surgical performance comes from 4 main silos. Unsurprisingly, technical proficiency is one of them. Secondly, it's about professional standards. Thirdly, it's about safety behaviors. And finally, it's about systems. And I've put their systems in yellow because it's the least well-represented one among surgeons. So if we're taking them in turn, technical proficiency, yes, you have to be an educated surgeon. You have to know that to do anastomosis, you need to have 2 points of fixation. Knowledge. The interesting thing here was that highly performing surgical teams focus not just on anatomical knowledge, but also integrated physiology and radiology. And I think that's very true in transplantation, where we have to be aware of the impact of dialysis on the patient, of anesthesia, of immunosuppression. So if you want to be a good surgeon, you have to have good integration of physiological, anatomical, and radiological knowledge. But the most interesting thing was about the key interventions. What we found was that to be a proficient surgeon, you have to be competent in 6 main areas. And we created an ABCD for this. Access, big problem, big hole. That's a mantra. Bleeding control, you need to know how to manage the one thing that all surgeons are scared of. Contamination, that is to say, how to create surgery which is sensitive to the issues of sepsis and antisepsis, in particular in an immunosuppressed child. Thirdly, about decompression. Surgeons need to be competent at decompressing or relieving obstruction in different tubes, whether it's abdominal compartment syndrome, whether it's a blocked ureter, or whether it's a thrombosed vessel. End organ perfusion, being sensitive to the implications of ischemia and the fact that these are time sensitive. And finally, about fluid management. From a professional standards point of view, this was the most controversial. Good, highly performing surgical teams believed in resilience. They said things like be strong, be perseverant, sometimes even be ruthless. People said that you have to get it right the first time. There was a culture of excellence, that is to say that you have to strive for perfection. And finally, about confidence, that is to say that when you feel a tug or a pressure or a barrier, that is not the time to let go. You have to get results. But what was really interesting was that really highly performing teams realized that these three traits, if taken to an extreme, could be really detrimental. Resilience taken to an extreme can lead to inflexibility and error denial. Excessive pursuit of excellence can lead to hubris. Same with confidence. So it was about balancing these with modesty and pragmatism that created really highly performing teams. The most novel part of the study was about safety behaviors. The first aspect of safety behavior was operator optimization. And what the study found was that truly performing surgeons understood they operated in three dimensions: physical, mental, and emotional. Often we ignore these. We have huge performance decay by operating when we're tired, undernourished, dehydrated. Same with mental capacity. We know that our minds become cognitively saturated and we experience loss of situational awareness. Similarly, we're not sensitive to environmental detractors like noise or interruptions. But most importantly, I think it's about emotional control. One of the things that came out over and over again was that good surgeons are able to stay calm in situations of adversity. And unfortunately, we are not trained how to deal with fear or anxiety. And I will have to say that a large proportion of surgeons enter the operating theatre with a lot of fear on board. The aberrant behaviours that sometimes surgeons display in those perioperative circumstances are very natural reactions that we as primates have to threatening stimuli. And the same that if you went home and you found someone with a knife in your living room, these are very real threats to one's own professional practice. Yet we don't have methods of mitigating those or training to overcome them. Secondly, it was about error avoidance. Good surgeons were people who were described as chess players, or people who were able to anticipate staying an hour, a day, maybe even a year ahead of your patient. People used to talk about in surgery you have to horizon scan. Surgeons also had to display monitoring behaviors. For example, seeing your patient twice a day, never taking anything for granted. One chief resident told his junior that if you want to be good, you should always do a midnight ward round. Always see your patient the last possible opportunity before going to bed to make sure that you've only got 6 hours left of that patient not having surgical input. And finally, error resolution. And this was something the surgeons weren't very good at, by and large, because we culturally don't think we get errors. But when things go wrong, highly performing surgical groups were able to mobilize all resources, both human and material, very early on. You have to call for help, use all tools, call all friends. And finally, it was about systems. And generally speaking, surgeons did not interact well with systems. And I was delighted to hear your talk and also Professor Moo's talk about tools. So the general mantra is that tools are good, but technology is better. The studies showed that surgeons loved interacting with tools, weren't too hot on technology. And if you think about it, we derided people who did laparoscopy in the 90s. Now that is a gold standard. Are we doing the same with robotics now? Maybe. We should think about it. Human networks and organizations. By and large, good surgeons are people who can interact with other people in the team and also who could actually work with administrative or management stakeholders to actually leverage more influence for their service and their operations. So in conclusion, what did we find? We started off with a question which asked, what does good performance look like? And now we think it comes in 4 silos: technique, high professional standards, the use of safety behaviors, and engagement with systems. But all of these are nowhere near as important as a culture with which we shape and adjust these 4 domains, and reminding us that actually good surgical training and education is about learning rules of the road and having guides that keep us in the highly performing section. I'd like to thank Hannah and Nick Savdalis and Nizam Mahmood who helped me with this project, and I'll take some questions. Thank you.
I would say we had to have more talks like this every day, probably, or often. Any questions? Any comments?
Thank you very much. Excellent analysis of surgical behavior. Great. I have to read it again in my spare time. To me, one piece is missing, not risk avoidance, but the other way around, risk taking, or ability to commit to take the risk as opposed to be safe and, you know, sleep well. Because often, if you don't take risk, you don't get the result which otherwise would be achievable.
Absolutely, thank you. So this is the reason why we don't talk about airplanes. When you look at safety in aviation, the wartime ethos of flying in the clouds and in the storm and against oncoming airplanes is just not there. If you're not happy to fly, you just don't take off. The flight gets cancelled. In surgery, we don't have that option. We have to operate. And that's where confidence comes in. Confidence comes in having this expectation of a positive outcome, this realistic understanding the risk is there, and the risk comes in 2 categories, modifiable and non-modifiable risk. And what your duty is to deal with the modifiable risk, which includes you as a person being a threat to your own operation, getting other people to help, and then just accepting that there will be non-modifiable risk. But that comes down to culture, because you will not take that risk if you are in an environment where error is not tolerated. And I think if you look at Lucien Leap, who's a great sort of luminary of safety culture in the 90s, JAMA 1993, January, pediatric surgeon actually who gave up pediatric practice to become a safety expert. He talks that in surgery we have a culture of perfectibility. That is to say, error is associated with shame. And more importantly, personal shame. I'm a bad person because I got a complication. I think if you work in that kind of environment, you're less likely to take risks that the patient wants you to take on their behalf. So it's about creating personal confidence and culture in your workplace that allows you to take on those high-risk cases.
Congratulations to this fantastic talk. So I have a question, as I find it so important. So when you think about this perfection, excellence, and confidence, could your work be a measure as we use now this failure to rescue in medicine, that the more risky operations you do, the more risky or the more sophisticated your patient is, it's not about the complications, but you need to get to the point where you do not miss the right time to rescue this situation. So did you study on this as well?
I did, yeah. So there are 3 phases of performance: avoid, trap, and mitigate. And most of the time we work at the mitigate level. Someone's come in with PTLD in their mouth or their tonsils, and it's already too late. It's what we said earlier. We want, you talked about screening in schools. Yes, we need to stay at the avoid level all the time. And there are certain behaviors that you can engage in to make sure that you don't get to the failure to rescue stage. You anticipate, but also it's about briefing, it's about having normal checklists, it's about practicing drills like we do with the robot, it's about empowering your team, it's about giving people a voice, and actually having feedback cycles. And again, aviation is great. There's a great TED talk about a US Air Force bomber pilot, and they do 24-hour bombing raids. And when they come back, instead of going and having a shower, they go straight into a 2-hour debrief, okay? Because that's where the learning happens. And we never really debrief. We tick boxes, but we don't actually systematically, meaningfully engage in analyzing our own errors. Most of the time, because we blame error on bad luck.
I mean, this is all very well, but what's it got to do with nurses or even nephrologists? I mean, nephrologists never get faced with difficult situations like surgeons, surely.
That's true. My PhD supervisor said that all the time as well. Well, I think what you have to realize... Okay, so can I quote Anita? Can I quote you on something you told me? Anita once, when I was at a low mode, took me to her office and said, Peter, you know, you're the captain of this great ship, but you've got to steer it with grace. You know, that was a typical Anita statement. And I think the truth is, that you have to kind of realize that, okay, yes, we're the captain of this operative ship, but we're in a big ocean with other people and other fish and other ships. And we are very interdependent with other specialties. And actually, if you look at high-performing teams, if you look at the Navy SEALs, it's about sharing vulnerabilities and not about putting on a face and trying to pretend you're all-knowing when you work with other people. We spoke about this before. There are 3 levels of interaction. There is a group, which are people that share a geography. There are teams, which are people who share purposes, and there are families, which are people that share vulnerabilities. And I think you want to move your team to the family level, where it's kind of okay to be in your pajamas and not look great and make mistakes, professionally speaking. Okay? So I think it is about getting everyone on board and being quite open to error.
Thanks, that was great. My question was sort of along those lines. I think you're talking about surgical culture and surgical excellence, but I think in the NHS particularly, the day-to-day outcomes and the mediocrity that we see is not a function of that actual individual surgical moment. Yeah. It's actually because the post-operative, urine output's not measured on the ward, and you can't kind of make a negative comment about that. You have to sort of smile, or as an example, there's just so much you don't have control over as a surgeon. And when you're trying to get your patient into theatre for that deceased donor, they're sticking an abscess in on the list without telling you. And actually, we have all of these sort of cultures and values all these organisations around the NHS have, but we're still pretty mediocre. And I don't know how we as surgeons actually affect the wider culture.
I think the way you do so is by assuming a role of leadership and saying, actually, I will be the disruptive force that changes it. Culture is changed by 2 things: calamities, and that could be a surgical leader coming in and saying, I'm going to disrupt the way we do things. It's hard. Or by, actually, if you look at the theory, change management is about telling stories. And, don't tell people what to do. Explain to them, once as a patient, that this happened to them. And I think the reason why you need to change urine output is because one nurse on this ward, a few years ago missed it, and then someone ended up losing their kidney. It's about what Nizam calls soft power. It's about trying to sort of change things without being too forceful, but at the same time having a sort of persistent force within a very focused direction that allows you to do that. But it's hard because also you have system issues in the NHS. I would also argue that actually competition is necessary. People respond very well to competition, and creating positive competition within teams allows people to drive progress forward. But there's no easy answer.
Thank you very much for a great session.